why does the food matrix effect apply to supplemental fiber but not to supplemental protein? Yeah, I did. I looked at it a little cross-eyed. You just made that little
It does.
face.
Yeah.
It does. In fact, that was my answer. But I wanted to actually discuss this a little bit more because I think, and some of this is probably our fault when we talk about the complex relationships of whole foods and how that differs from the isolated nutrients from those foods. We just kind of hand wave it away and say, well, it's the food matrix effect. And people are like, the food, what? Is Keanu Reeves the lead star in this particular movie? All right, so let's talk about what the food matrix is and what the food matrix effect is and go from there. The food matrix refers to not only the chemical and physical components of food, but also their molecular relationships that affect how food is digested and metabolized. The food matrix effect refers to how the whole food, like an apple, for example, influences a particular outcome, like feelings of fullness or satiety, or a health parameter compared to one of its nutrients in isolation, so like a particular flavonoid that an apple contains. And so how this might be practically applied is if a study comes out or a mainstream media headline comes out and says, eating an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Okay, maybe that came out like turn of the century or whatever. Somebody might say, well, it's the flavonoids or it's the tocopherols or whatever it is, And so they try to isolate and they're successfully able to isolate this thing. And now it's a supplement. You can take, apple flavonoid 3, whatever,
Yeah.
And they're like, see, basically it's like eating apples. But those things are different. Those things are different because the sum of all of the things that makes an apple is greater than the parts. So it's not just the flavonoids, not just the fiber, for example, or in this case, the protein, but it is the complex relationship of the whole food. And so using the fiber example here, increasing the intake of fiber from whole foods, for example, that tends to be more filling. So people feel fuller, and they tend to reduce total energy intake to a greater degree when compared to people increasing fiber by supplementing. And the reasons for this are complex. It's not just the fiber, but it's the fact that that whole food that contains fiber replaces or displaces other foods, and the subsequent dietary pattern changes. The same people who are, adding broccoli or like legumes or whatever to their diet, that more changes are occurring than just, they just increase more fiber. No. You took something else out of your diet. For example, you've shifted your dietary pattern en masse because, you weren't eating legumes before, and now you are, and you're doing other stuff. So there's a behavioral component here. Other nutrients in the whole food could be contributory, whether it's a vitamin, whether it's another micronutrient, not just fiber. The way the fiber is actually packaged structurally within the food itself can be contributory. So generally speaking, increasing dietary fiber via supplementation does not have the same health effects as increasing whole food sources of fiber. The one major sort of time that this does not apply is when we talk about lowering LDL, for example, triglycerides as well. People can take massive amounts of dietary supplemental fiber and get continued lowering of those two parameters, which is the same you would see from whole food. But it is impractical to tell somebody, hey, I want you to get 70 grams of fiber a day from whole foods. Like, what? Yeah, it's probably not going to happen.
I've had a couple patients who were willing to go for it. One guy who had familial hypercholesterolemia, and he was actually managing to get over 100 grams of fiber a day from foods.
Oh boy.
And I was like, respect, but also your toilet's doing the most here.
Yeah, honest. You're the real MVP. That porcelain, yeah. Yikes. So when I think about protein, I think that there is a similar relationship between supplemental protein and whole food-based protein for some outcomes of interest, but not all outcomes of interest. So muscle-related outcomes, if we're talking about hypertrophy, strength, for example, or signaling of muscle protein synthesis, I would predict that a whey protein supplement in isolation is going to do the same as chicken, right? The protein that's doing the same from that particular sort of aspect. But that doesn't mean that it's the same for all health outcomes. So like hunger and satiety, feelings of fullness. We know that people who get their protein, for example, from whole foods, they tend to have a higher degree of satiety than after a shake. And that's been pretty well established across all sorts of different foods. When foods are presented in like a semi-solid or solid form, people tend to eat less later on than if they had that same amount of calories and nutrients in liquid form. Okay. It's just, there are other examples like this. And so I just wouldn't say that the food matrix effect or whatever is either all or none. It just depends on the outcome of interest, depends on the particular food. And I would even further say that like protein is the isolated nutrient from chicken, and chicken itself has protein, has some fat, has some other nutrients that supplemental protein doesn't have. And so the reason why eating chicken in various ways that can be prepared might be more satiating or produce a different set of outcomes than a supplemental protein is probably due to all of the things that make chicken a unique sort of food compared to just protein being bland, dispensed from like your refrigerator or something like that. Does that make sense to you? We're talking about
there's been trials. I mean, one caveat is also you were kind of building in an assumption that they're proteins of similar quality, right? So if you have, a collagen supplement or something versus a whey, or collagen versus an animal protein source or a sufficiently dosed plant protein source, you might, even with muscle, see a different level of,
Totally.
outcomes from that. But if it's assuming equivalent kind of protein quality, then yeah, just purely hypertrophy, they are going to tend to be pretty similar. But there have been randomized trials even comparing different protein sources. I remember one paper that was comparing, for example, like white meat poultry versus, I think it was fish versus tofu or something like that. And you end up seeing different outcomes in terms of various cardiovascular risk markers, blood lipids, things like that. And so you can't say that, well, not that you can't, but you should not conclude that the different amino acids themselves are driving differences in the patient's, blood cholesterol levels and their cardiovascular risk. It's the whole food item. And so from those foods, maybe if they're similar protein quality, similar dose, you might get similar muscle effects out of it, but maybe some of them are going to have more favorable effects on your lipids and cardiovascular risk and others more unfavorable. And I think that most of the folks listening to this should probably account for things like that when it comes to their habitual protein sources, right? So some folks get really on the bandwagon of, I need all animal-derived protein sources all the time, high dose to ensure adequate muscle, development. And so I'm just going to go all beef all the time. And I'm like, well, I can feel pretty confident that that's likely from the dietary protein standpoint to maximize your muscle adaptations. But I also think that if you were to swap out some servings or many servings of that with some of these other options along the way, you might maintain similar gains from the muscular side while also enjoying health benefits and other kind of more varied nutritional benefits from the other food sources as part of your overall dietary pattern. So swapping out some of that for some salmon, swapping out some of that for some legumes, swapping out some of that for, other things is generally wise, I think.
Yeah, we just cannot assume that reductionist sort of, type analysis that like, okay, if you separate this one thing from the whole food it came from, that it's going to work the exact same. And we just call that, when we find differences, we just call the reason for all of that the food matrix effect. Now, teasing out what the exact sort of, contribution between structure versus behavioral versus like co-occurring nutrients, well, that's above our pay grade, to speak for every potential thing here. But yeah, hopefully that was a good discussion about the food matrix and the food matrix effect.